Yeah.
¿Y cuánto valen alquiladas?
Hello, humans who are here.
Hi, Leslie.
Oh, it's so good to see y'all. It's Karis.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the Virtual Scholars Day presentation of Leslie Howard. Just a little housekeeping. Please make sure your microphone and video are muted and your computer sound is turned on. The Carl Goodson Honors Program hosts OBU's annual Scholars Day and is sponsored by OBU's Alpha Tau Student Honors Organization. Scholars Day focuses on the academic achievements accomplished throughout the school year by students from various disciplines. The presentations and papers are digitally archived on OBU's Scholarly Commons. Today's presentation is by Leslie Howard, a double major in psychology and studio art. She is a graduating senior this May. Leslie, are you ready to begin your presentation? Leslie, are you ready to begin?
Yes,
Okay.
sorry.
That's all right.
Can I share my screen? All right. So before I get started, I want to make sure to thank Dr. White for providing all the materials and all the compensation, literally everything I needed for the study. Also, Donnie Copeland for providing space in the art department for participants. Also, Professor Faird for her constant guidance throughout this process. And everybody who participated, especially those who completed the entire 6 weeks study. So to summarize my research in one sentence, I developed and tested the effectiveness of an online 6-week art DBT program aimed at reducing rumination and, if present, non-suicidal self-injury. So with that in mind, what we're going to do is take a look at just the rationale behind my study, what actually happened, what occurred, future directions of more research. So to summarize my rationale, as condensed as it can be, I would say there's 3 main parts. The first is that rumination contributes to non-suicidal self-injury. The next would be that targeting rumination in the context of DBT could significantly reduce NSSI. And then last, including art therapy may increase DBT adherence and even enhance treatment with unique art therapy benefits. So to dive into the first part, I'll start with some definitions. Non-suicidal self-injury is the process of injuring oneself without the intent to cause one's death. This is different from the term self-harm, and apart from suicidal ideation, this is the strongest predictor of suicide. Rumination is when an individual puts a really high focus on internal negative feelings rather than external circumstances. So going over something over and over and over again, it keeps them from processing adaptive ways to deal with distress. And you're all probably familiar with that feeling. Now, how these two things connect is that some respond to this rumination exacerbated negative state by engaging in non-suicidal self-injury. This is an attempt to externalize these negative feelings and provide a temporary relief of sorts from the internal distress that they're experiencing. Research also supports this, and that rumination does significantly moderate between high negative affectivity and non-suicidal self-injury. But it is important to note that rumination is just one possible factor in this whole relationship. It's a lot more complex. And also, research into these fields aren't in controlled experiments. So we can't ethically manipulate non-suicidal self-injury. And because of this, we can't assume causality. The second part of my rationale, which is targeting rumination in DBT could reduce NSSI. So why this particular treatment? Well, it's already a popular and successful treatment for NSSI. DBT theorizes that pervasive emotion dysregulation is what's contributing to this self-harm behavior. So its goal is to target this emotion dysregulation and replace maladaptive responses like self-harm with more productive responses. But there are some drawbacks. There's a really high participant dropout rate. And this could be due to the fact that it's a very strenuous treatment. Just for instance, at the left hand of your screen, you'll see just some of the skills you would learn in the emotion regulation module of the skills training facet of DBT. So it's a very strenuous treatment. Another thing contributing to dropout are some individual characteristics, particularly those with low emotional acceptance are more likely to drop out of treatment. But including art therapy may actually increase adherence to DBT while also enhancing the treatment with some unique benefits. I'll go ahead and define art therapy, which is using various artistic processes along with the guidance of a trained art therapist. That's a very important part to assist in reaching treatment goals. Some benefits include emotional acceptance. So art therapy helps patients explore and organize and portray their emotions in a safer way. Also, in terms of mindfulness, art just has a really natural and unique relationship. If you've ever participated in some form of art making, you're probably aware of its connection just to the present moment, and research also does support this. Also important to note about mindfulness is that it can decrease and protect against non-suicidal self-injury and rumination. Now to what I actually did. I wanted to, in light of all this research, to test the effects of ART-DBT, which is my independent variable, on rumination and non-suicidal self-injury, both dependent variables. I also wanted to see if there was a relationship between these two things. So I first hypothesized that ART-DBT would significantly decrease these two variables. And then I hypothesized for my second hypothesis that a significant positive relationship would exist between NSSI and rumination. My first step to do this was obviously to develop an ART-DBT program. I felt the safest option would be an online skills-based program since I'm not a trained clinician. The content of the program was directly corresponding to the DBT skills training handouts and manuals, and all activities that appeared were from the Art DBT handbook by a practicing Art DBT therapist. And the structure of the program itself was based closely on an existing online self-help program. So this was very grounded in research. I was not. The program was 6 weeks long, approximately an hour each week doing Art DBT activities. Everything was on the website Our Campus, which is basically an online classroom. And this is where participants submitted and received their weekly materials. For compensation, participants needed to complete at least 2/3 of the activities and would receive. The structure of the RDD program itself was each week, participants would receive information and reasoning behind the activities they did, as well as completing 2 activities and a recurring visual journal activity. They would also receive various surveys for participation and assessments. This is just one example of an activity we did. You can do it right now even if you have like a pencil nearby. It's called Loops of Containment. And basically it's just making a bunch of loopy scribbles all over a paper and then filling in the solid shapes with different colors. It is surprisingly fun and very relaxing. I would recommend this. Now, the step was to actually recruit participants. So what I first did was conduct a practice survey for all OBU students on rumination and non-suicidal self-injury. Rumination, so 171 participants completed this survey, and my next step was to determine a high rumination group. To qualify for this group, people had to score 1 standard deviation above normative means. 78 qualified and were invited to participate over email. 29 do this. 1 gave an invalid email address, so the remaining 28 I randomly assigned to the control and treatment groups. And then after 6 weeks, 11 people completed the entire study. 8 were in the control group, 3 were in the treatment group, and bi-weekly both groups were assessed on rumination and non-suicidal self-injury. So what actually happened? The prevalence survey, the second hypothesis actually was supported. So there was a significant positive correlation between NSSI and rumination at a 0.1 level of significance. But for the high rumination group, the hypothesis wasn't supported. So a correlation did not exist between these 2 variables. And I also saw this among the final 11. And this could be due to a restriction of range. So for these smaller populations, I used a specific subset. So it was a lot smaller and less diverse. And so we were less able to observe correlations taking place. But ultimately, hypothesis 2 was partially supported. So a significant correlation between NSSI and rumination did occur, given that the sample was large and diverse. Now, before we get into treatment effects, I just want to remind everybody that this was a study that was very correlational in nature, so we can't infer causality. Also, my sample size was incredibly small, especially the treatment group, which was only 3 participants. So I couldn't run traditional statistical analyses. And because of all these factors, we really can't assume any effects or lack of effects without using a larger sample size. In terms of NSSI, to calculate effects, I averaged baseline and week 6 scores and compared each group's averages to one another and from baseline to week 6. Basically, the hypothesis that NSSI would decrease in the treatment group was not supported. You can tell that these scores were pretty stable. You can also see this in the graphs. For the most part, the data is pretty flat. And this could be due to the fact that there was lower baseline levels of NSSI to begin with. And also the ART-DBT program didn't specifically target NSSI. It was targeted at rumination. And if effects were to occur, it may have taken longer for them to show up in data. Also, since rumination and NSSI weren't correlated to begin with at baseline, targeting rumination wouldn't have affected NSSI to begin with. So it could be a variety of things. But for rumination, after calculating everything the same way as NSSI, we actually did see a decrease in the treatment group in terms of rumination. Both groups did have reduced scores, but the treatment group in particular had much more dramatic reductions. You can also see this in the graphs. There's a visual trend happening. And whenever you compare within groups, treatment groups rumination decrease just over twice the amount of the control groups. So that's pretty notable. And this is most likely due to the fact we did specifically target rumination. So that's a pretty straightforward explanation on that one. Can't acknowledge some limitations to the study. The most prominent one being the coronavirus happening. Specifically at the beginning of week 3, so exactly in the middle of my study, everybody on OBU's campus had to leave. So this obviously added some external stress and anxiety. Changing environments could have definitely affected data. Ultimately, there were probably some history effects happening in our results. Also related to this, there was a change in the way I had to distribute materials. The website I was having participants submit things on, they changed the policy and added, which being a college student, that's not going to happen. So I shifted to an email distribution of weekly materials, and participants in turn were submitting their materials through emails. And basically, nobody enjoyed that, especially myself. We all know how emails work. They get lost. It's really tedious to scroll through and find that one email you were looking for. And this most likely contributed to the high dropout rate we saw, which is related to the last major limitation of our small sample size. We've already talked about how the correlational nature of the study. All of these factors does limit how we interpret the data. But overall, the results did indicate a relationship between NSSI and rumination, given the sample was large and diverse. And they also suggest that an online rumination-targeted ART-DBT program can potentially decrease rumination, but whether it could also reduce NSSI still remains to be seen. So in the future, we definitely should study these variables with a larger, more diverse population. It would also be really interesting to look at what platform is the best for this online treatment, as well as what is online ART-DBT better or is in-person ART-DBT better? What's the best and most effective way for this treatment to work? But the key for future research is to provide high quality empirical data so that we can identify and target factors underlying non-suicidal self-injury. Ultimately, we can develop interventions that both maximize the benefits of treatment and promote effective healing among those who struggle with NSSI and high rumination. And if anyone has questions, feel free to ask.
Myra, you have a question?
I do. Leslie, great presentation, and your work sounds really interesting, and kudos for trooping through this with the COVID situation. I know you've had a lot of stuff disrupted. My question had to do with when you were selecting participants and you needed or had sort of different levels of rumination it looked like for male and female participants, and I was just wondering why that was.
Yes, let's see if I can go back to that slide. Yes, the data I used for normative scores, they actually did find a difference between male and female rumination amounts. So it was just slightly different. So I wanted to make sure I stayed with the original research. But yeah, I did notice that was interesting. Like that's a whole part of research that, you know, I didn't get the joy of looking into, but yes, they are different.
Yeah, that's a whole nother thesis. Thank you.
Yeah, for real.
Any other questions?
I have one. Leslie, what kind of feedback did you get from your students? I know you did an exit survey with them. What kind of things did they say about the art portion specifically?
For the most part, everybody really enjoyed the interview. I actually have a lovely slide that kind of gives an overview of this feedback. One participant, I actually commented about how they just made more art when they were stressed or bored, which is really cool after a couple weeks of participating. Interestingly, there wasn't a lot of negative feedback about the online format. The two participants that responded said that they like how it's anonymous and that even though that having that online component made them feel more comfortable about doing art as compared to how it may feel in a group setting. The also was apparently appropriate, and one of my favorite things that I read was that one participant was kind of sad that it would end. So I think the main negative feedback was about the email distribution method, and I definitely agree with that. So no emails for future references.
And I have another question, if that's okay. Since you mentioned both theoretically and it seems like from your feedback that maybe the art incorporated into DBT would help with treatment adherence. Do you think that non-artists, non-art therapists would be able to incorporate those kind of techniques too, or would they really need that specialized training?
I'm pretty sure that a lot of treatments do kind of just have every now and then an art sort of activity. I know in the art DBT handbook that I got basically everything from, it is recommended to have training, but it's also encouraged to, every now and then try one of these activities. So I guess kind of both ways, but if you want to be a specifically art DBT therapist, training is probably key.
Great presentation, Leslie. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of our watchers and those that participated today. You can view this presentation and others at scholarlycommons.obu.edu. Thank you very much for being here. Have a good afternoon.